Good afternoon, and welcome to Reproaction's Act and Learn webinar for the month of April 2020. We are proud and disturbed to present today's topic, Seeking Justice, Sexual Assault by Police. Before we dive in, we'll introduce your hosts. The first voice you hear is myself. I'm Erin Matson. I use she, her pronouns. I'm based in Arlington, Virginia, and I invite you to follow me on Twitter at Erin to the Max.
And I am Pamela Merritt. I am the other co-founder and co-director of Reproaction. My pronouns are she, her. I live in St. Louis, Missouri, and you can follow me on Twitter at SharkFoo. So tonight's agenda, or I'm sorry, this afternoon's agenda, is a quick introduction of Reproaction for people who aren't familiar with us. And then I'm going to walk through some statistics to help frame the discussion on sexual misconduct by law enforcement. And then we're going to dive right into our panel discussion. First, we're going to have a Q&A with Chelsea Merta of Lotus Law, and then Grace Franklin, who is the founder and executive director of OKC Artists for Justice. After that, we'll go through some next steps, and then there will be time for Q&A at the end of the webinar. The hashtag for live tweeting is #Reproaction. So Reproaction leads bold action to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. We have a bold left flank analysis. We are incredibly proud of our willingness to hold folks on all sides accountable, whether they identify as allies or the opposition, and we have a deep commitment to nonviolent direct action. So, sexual misconduct and assault by law enforcement is a broad concern, and we won't be able to cover every angle of it on this webinar. In our hour together, our hope is to highlight some systemic failures by exploring specific cases and incidents. Bowling Green State University's Henry A. Wallace Police Crime Database published the results of a national review of media reports and court records over a 9-year period. They found that police officers in the United States were charged with forcible rape 405 times between 2005 and 2013. That's an average of 45 assaults a year. Forcible fondling was more common, with 638 instances. Most of the misconduct cases involved motorists, young people who were shadowing jobs, students, victims of violence, and informants. Research also found that Black women, women of color, trans folk, people on parole or with a criminal record, immigrants, and undocumented people were at high risk. One of the conclusions was that a police officer is accused of an act of sexual misconduct at least every 5 days. Next slide. It's important to understand that law enforcement includes prison and jail guards, and police in schools and at community centers. All people who are incarcerated or detained are at risk, and they face intimidation and harassment for reporting their rapes or assaults. In spring of 2016, Anquinette Woodall was 3 years into her 15-year sentence for armed burglary and robbery when she was raped by an officer at Gadsden Correctional Facility. Quoting from this 2019 Miami Herald article, to cement her silence, the guard, Travis Henson, said that he knew the address of Woodall's mother, the caretaker of her 2 small children. The rapist ultimately pled guilty, but but the prison didn't take any measures to ensure safety or to fix the systemic problems that allowed for that crime to occur. Woodall was moved to a different facility and told that the FDC, Florida Department of Corrections, would not pick up the cost of an abortion had she decided not to carry the prison guard rapist child to term. Next slide. A St. Louis woman reported her sexual assault by an on-duty police officer in June of 2015. She had called to report a stolen car. After the assault, she turned over evidence of that assault, a towel that contained the police officer's DNA. The officer resigned less than a week later. And after what they term an internal investigation, the St. Louis Circuit Attorney declined to press charges. The survivor participated in a documentary later in December of 2017. And as a result of the media coverage from outlets like the Riverfront Times and Patch, and ultimately, finally, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, the city's new circuit attorney, Kim Gardner, charged the former officer with sodomy on January 31st, 2018. It's important to note that in this case as well, there has been no measurable change to the way police are investigated or how those crimes are handled. And much to our horror is when we realize that when a police officer resigns, they can get hired at another police department. In March of this year, news broke that as many as 7 women, including at least 3 police officers, have accused multiple St. Louis police officers of sexual assault stretching back to 2010. Next slide. In a few minutes, we're going to hear from St. Louis-based attorney Chelsea Merta about her work seeking justice for survivors in St. Louis, including a woman who was raped by a police officer in 2008. In that case, the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department filed suit to deny survivor access to evidence of her own sexual assault. When the survivor spoke out about her rape on Facebook, the rapist applied for and was granted a restraining order. It was thrown out, but the survivor was even accused after that of violating that restraining order by the St. Louis County prosecutor after it had already been tossed out. Next slide. So it is my pleasure to introduce Chelsea Merta. Chelsea is a lifelong public servant and community activist. She previously served as staff attorney for legal aid organization Arch City Defenders, representing and advocating for homeless, indigent, and underserved women in the St. Louis County Municipal Court system. She also served as a lawyer and consultant for St. Louis area legislators and policymakers, assisting with the drafting of legislation for consumer issues, environmental concerns, civil rights, women's rights, and social justice. You can follow her on Twitter at Chelsea K. Merta, and you can visit her law firm at Lotus Law LLC. Welcome, Chelsea.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Pamela. I really appreciate the opportunity today to share a little bit about some of the work I've been doing in St. Louis on this issue.
Fantastic. So let's dive right in. In August of 2018, I read an article on a local outlet about a woman who was being charged by the St. Louis County prosecutors for violating a protective order that had been tossed out already by a judge. That woman had accused a police officer of rape, but she ended up being charged she ended up being the only person charged. Can you tell us a little bit about this case?
Sure. So my client's journey started back in 2008 when she was sexually assaulted by a St. Louis police officer who was wearing his uniform and had just gotten off duty. After the assault, my client had gone through all the right steps. She filed a police report. She went, got a rape kit done. The officer's uniform was confiscated for evidence, and an internal affairs report was filed, but that's where everything sort of got left. And so flash forward about 10 years and the Me Too movement started to become very prevalent. And so after 10 years of living with this trauma, my client finally felt empowered to share her story publicly. And our adventure together actually began in the St. Louis City Justice Center, where she had been arrested. In a nutshell, not just one order of protection had been filed against her, but we had between 12 and 15 separate orders of protections across 3 different counties that had actually been filed by the police officer who assaulted her, his brother, who is also a police officer, his wife, and a number of the Thin Blue Line supporters. So there were some people who had never even met my client, never heard her, they had no contact whatsoever, and they were filing orders of protection against her, all because she chose to speak up and share her story. So after we got her out of jail, we started knocking out those orders of protection, and I believe less than a week after one of the orders of protection had been thrown out of court. And it's worth noting too that the officer and his brother and his family, essentially, they didn't even show up to court whenever we had our hearing date for that order of protection to be entered permanently. What they were trying to obtain is called an ex parte order of protection, and those are usually granted same day, and they're temporary pending a full hearing. But essentially that's what they were trying to do, is they were shopping around in different counties, which just underscores, you know, the egregious behavior in this whole situation. So they were shopping around in different counties trying to get judges to grant these ex parte orders of protection. So in the meantime, they could file police reports and claim that my client had violated them. And essentially it was a coordinated, very orchestrated effort to put my client in jail. After we got her out and we kind of made some headway on the orders of protections, we did a sunshine request. In other states, they call them FOIA, Freedom of Information Act requests, for her police report. She was the victim. She's entitled to the report as a victim. However, I got denied my request on several occasions. So it wasn't just, oh, there's an ongoing investigation. It was, oh, this is protected information that might jeopardize the officer. And I just kept getting excuse after excuse as to why the police department would not turn over my client's, the report that she had filed in 2008. So this is about 10 years, and it was just incredible to me. So I got a notification that the city of St. Louis had filed a lawsuit against me to block me from obtaining my client's police report. And thankfully we had some local media coverage that helped to put the pressure on the police department. I mean, it was just so egregious, the police department blocking a victim from obtaining her own police report. And then once we got the report, it was pretty apparent why they were holding on to that for so long. And essentially what it boiled down to was evidence was collected, a rape kit was done, there was evidence obtained, I mean, a very clear-cut sexual assault type preparation work, but they never proceeded forward with it. And it's just par for the course as far as how St. Louis Police Department has usually handled sexual assault investigations, not just, you know, civilian against civilian, but officer against civilian. And that really opened my eyes as to how the department truly operates. I mean, their default was, no, you don't get this report, where it should be more, okay, this is the victim, this is her police report, she's absolutely entitled to it. It just really highlighted the hubris, really, of the police department, and how not only they handle their own sort of internal investigations, but external as well. So that was incredibly eye-opening. We did get all of the orders of protections dismissed, all of the criminal charges, but one were thrown out, and the one that did not get thrown out was not related to a police officer. So it was a completely separate situation, but that's all been since resolved. So Yeah, the whole experience of wrestling with St. Louis Police Department over, a victim's police report just really emphasizes, how this system has enabled this type of behavior to happen for so long.
Yeah, thank you so much for breaking that all down. It's just it's alarming, but not shocking,
Right.
as somebody who lives in the city, because it doesn't feel like there's a lot of accountability. Could you talk just quickly about that issue of the relationship between the police department, who are basically being tasked with investigating themselves when the rapist is a member of the department, and the St. Louis County prosecutor or the city prosecutors, and how that can actually also stonewall both reform, but also just getting justice?
Sure. So essentially, the police department, they are tasked with putting together a case. It's their obligation essentially to take a report from a victim. They are generally supposed to either travel with or meet a victim at a hospital in order to get the rape kit done. The rape kit is supposed to be picked up same day as soon as it's completed. And then it's supposed to be sent to a lab and investigated. Clothing is supposed to be obtained. And I'm using the word supposed to be a lot because these are all really areas where this system collapses. So where we know what's supposed to happen, these are all just opportunities, quote unquote, really where the ball gets dropped. And that's why a lot of victims don't see progress on their case. So there's all sorts of things that are supposed to happen before a file is even turned over to a prosecuting attorney. And then it's up to the prosecuting attorney. They have the discretion, whether city or county or wherever you are, the prosecutor has the discretion to look at the case that's on their desk, look at the evidence that's been collected, determine if any additional evidence is needed in order to pursue pressing charges. So I've had a few clients who have been sexually assaulted by St. Louis City police officers, St. Louis County police officers, just all across the board in this area. And one thing that I've kind of noticed is the tactic of admitting to sexual contact, but denying that there was a lack of consent. And essentially what that does is it sort of negates a lot of times the purpose of a rape kit. And the purpose of a rape kit is to connect the DNA that is collected from a victim after an assault and identify who the assailant is. So a lot of times what I've seen is that the tactic is to admit, yeah, I had, intercourse or I had some sort of sexual contact, but there was consent. She was, totally on the same page with it. And essentially what that does is that kind of takes the wind out of a victim's sails, because then the obligation falls onto the prosecuting attorney to prove that consent was not given and the assault was in fact an assault. And essentially that's where I've seen a lot more cases head, just because the chances of having the issue prosecuted seem to fall off. It's a lot easier to prove that someone had sexual contact with a victim whenever there has been a rape kit done and you do have that DNA evidence that connects those dots. But when a perpetrator or a police officer in this situation admits to having sexual contact, but then admits that it was consensual, it makes it really difficult for a prosecuting attorney to pursue those charges. So, and you can probably see all the different ways that that can become problematic when you have specifically a situation of a sexual assault perpetrated by a police officer.
Got it. Thank you so much for that. So just as a quick reminder, if you do have questions for Chelsea, you can drop them in the question tab of your GoToWebinar control panel. So my next question is when do you come in as a lawyer? I think some people who are listening to this webinar might not be familiar with survivors or victims having their own counsel. So when do survivors of sexual assault by police usually reach out to a lawyer?
So in my experience, survivors generally contact attorneys much longer after the fact. And I believe that it's specifically because survivors, as they go through the process, they're discouraged from obtaining legal representation. And what I mean by that is it's generally not explicitly told to survivors that they have the right to an attorney. And just as someone who's been accused of committing a crime has a right to an attorney, victims do as well. And a lot of times that's sort of displaced that obligation, not obligation, but the representation aspect is generally placed on, they call them SART advocates, sexual assault response teams. And it's a team that's made up of individuals who generally work for police departments, and it can include social workers, it can include detectives for sex crimes, which the last time I checked, actually, of note, St. Louis City does not have any female detectives in their sex crimes department, which is also a problem. But essentially, women or men who are sexually assaulted in St. Louis, they have this SART that's assigned to them, and they are sometimes encouraged to go to counseling through a program that we have with the YWCA, and other times they're not. I've gotten mixed reports on when someone has actually been advised as to whether that they have the opportunity to seek counseling for the traumas that they've had to go through. But that's not really, victims really aren't told that, if you want to get an attorney, or you should look for having an advocate, a legal representative on your side. That's not a conversation that the police tend to be candid about having. And a lot of times what I've noticed is it's obviously intentional that victims are not encouraged to get their own representation. And it's because, sort of like what I just went through earlier, as far as the process goes, there's so many different ways that the process can fail, as far as like what evidence is supposed to be collected, when things are supposed to be picked up from the hospital. There's so many different places where a police department can truly drop the ball and even, incur liability for not, doing their due diligence to protect a victim, or really do their jobs. So unfortunately, victims oftentimes don't contact attorneys until after the fact, and it makes things a little easier when we are retained more on the front end, because we can make sure that things get done the way that they're supposed to. We can make sure that those rape kits are picked up from the hospital the same day. We can make sure that services are being offered for victims of sexual assaults. We can make sure that the right questions are being asked of our clients when they report the assaults, because I've sat in interviews before where the officer or the detective who's taking a statement from a victim isn't even asking the right questions as to determine what even happened. They get really fixated on sort of these extraneous details that have nothing to do with the actual assault. And, from my lawyer brain, I kind of see that as intentionally trying to undermine, a potential case. So I would love for more victims to be in the position where they can reach out to legal counsel, if anything, to have someone to help guide them through the process, because it is confusing. It's intentionally meant to be distracting and difficult, and I think everybody kind of needs assistance whenever they go through something like this, just to make sure that their rights are protected and they do get the support that they need.
Got it. Thank you. Quick question: if a police officer resigns or is fired for sexual misconduct, but not prosecuted, do they lose their license, or can they still work in law enforcement?
So we've kind of seen a lot of this happen in Missouri, especially post-Ferguson, where, you know, officers who have committed some sort of misconduct are given the opportunity to resign from their specific municipality or their specific county, and that really gives them the opportunity to go elsewhere and without a lot of discipline or without a lot of oversight. I'm not aware. I know there's been a few cases where officers have lost their licenses in the state of Missouri after, you know, being accused of sexual assault or even being found guilty of sexual assault. But as I'm sure you can imagine, it's very much a tip of the iceberg type thing. So, you know, for every one officer who loses his license in the state of Missouri, you have probably dozens more that are actually committing the crimes and getting away with it. So as difficult as it is to get a civilian prosecuted criminally for a sexual assault, it's so much more difficult to get a police officer brought to justice for committing a sexual assault. And then on top of that, you've got the issue of their license. So it's so difficult to do. I know it's happened a handful of times, but certainly not enough. And there's really no good way of tracking in the state of Missouri, at least, why one officer was, you know, forced into resignation or fired in one county and then shows up in another county or another municipality. We just don't have a good way to track that.
Thank you so much. And so we've got about 2 or 3 minutes left, but I want to get this question in. How can people advocate for justice or reform on this specific issue when a survivor is out there without advocates? How can people support survivors of sexual assault or sexual misconduct by law enforcement in their community?
Sure. So we've had a few people show up to court hearings, and that means so much to survivors. You know, anytime a group of strangers shows up to support you, it's really empowering. So if you have the opportunity to show up to court hearings just to be supportive of victims, I would certainly recommend that. Otherwise, elevating voices and stories of women and men who have survived sexual assault by police officers. You know, victims, especially these types of crimes, they face a much different type of backlash than people who are sexually assaulted by non-police officers. You always are going to have the naysayers and the rape deniers who come out, but it is a totally different ball game when you have the courage to speak out against the thin blue line, really. And, you know, you get the back the badge crazies that come out of the woodwork and just are constantly, you know, ruining victims' lives. I mean, in one of my clients' cases, they were calling DP or DFS to get her children taken away and making all sorts of false reports that we had to deal with on the side. So, you know, if there's ever the opportunity to just elevate, share the stories, be supportive, you know, talk to friends and family members who may not realize that this is a lot more prevalent in police departments than most people want to realize. So those would be my suggested ways to be supportive and advocate for justice.
Thank you so much. And I should note that sexual misconduct is the second most common claim that is filed as for misconduct by police officers. Chelsea, thank you. We're going to ask for you to hang on for some Q&A at the end. And again, the hashtag for live tweeting is Reproaction. And if you do have questions throughout this webinar, just drop them in the question tab of the GoToWebinar control panel. And with that, I will hand it over to Erin.
Thank you, Pamela, and thank you, Chelsea, for that enlightening and disturbing discussion. So I'm pleased to introduce Grace E. Franklin, who is a published poet, playwright, actress, and director born in Oklahoma City. She attended Lincoln University in Jefferson City, Missouri, and has been a featured artist in Atlanta, Dallas, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. She released her third book of poetry and CD, Up from Red Clay. In October 2014, she was the founder of OKC Artists for Justice. The organization, oh, go ahead. Oh, okay. And the organization was formed to ensure that women of color have an opportunity to receive justice and national attention as they struggle with disproportionate rates of violence and sexual assault. Ms. Franklin has received the Woman of Action Award from the National Organization for Women. She is committed to the spiritual, political, and physical liberation of women of color through advocacy, community work, and policy changes. Grace, thank you for joining us today.
Great to be here. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, let's dive right in. So tell us a bit, how did OKC Artists for Reproductive Justice come to be founded, and what is it?
Okay. So OKC Artists for Justice, we just call it OA4J. It's a long name. We try to shut it down. So it was organized around the Daniel Holtzclaw case. So when Daniel Holtzclaw is a former Oklahoma City police officer who eventually got convicted of raping Black women, he's basically a serial rapist who is escalating in violence. When that first started, he was initially charged with raping 10 women, and he got a $5 million bond set for him. So at that point, we were like, okay, boom, he's charged, he's in jail, bail $5 million. That seems reasonable when you're talking about 10 women. His bail was reduced to $500,000 by a different judge. So the case was reassigned to a different judge, went to $500,000 bail, and he was sent home with an ankle monitor. With that action, we knew that there needed to be attention on this case. These were 10 Black women at the time who were from the poorest part of the African-American side of Oklahoma City. And as women and men in our community, we just wanted to make sure that these women had advocates. These women knew that somebody was out here fighting for them, and we did not want this case to be swept up under the rug. We didn't want to look up and then, 2 years later you find out, oh, no, the charges were dropped. Oh, he didn't get any time, even if convicted. We wanted to make sure that this officer was off the street, the predator was off the street. So that's how we were formed. We were formed initially to bring attention to the case with Daniel Holtzclaw in Oklahoma City.
Wow, very upsetting. So can you tell us a bit about your membership, who is involved, and also has there been any changes in your membership since this all got started in 2014?
Right, so after he was convicted in 2015, initially our membership was based on volunteers. You just signed up, you were a member, boom, membership. So as we evolved as an organization, still with the same mission, we've just changed slightly in what we do. Our membership has changed. At this point, all of our members, we don't necessarily have a membership. We have volunteer programs for people to sign up in for any type of event that we have. We're looking back towards moving to a membership-based organization, but right now we're more community-based, and people volunteer and just come out and help in different organizations. So our functioning body, so how we make decisions, how we decide what we're going to do, is based on a board. And in that board are people in different parts of the community. We have people who work with domestic violence, with sexual assault. We have psychologists and psychiatrists, and we try to do programs that are art-based for women who are recovering from sexual assault, domestic violence, which has changed over time a bit. I think at first we tried to bite off the whole apple. That didn't work very well. So we wanted to become specialists in what we do in helping Black women.
Thank you. And can you talk a little more? So the fact is that Daniel Holtzclaw, the serial rapist, was attacking Black women specifically. Can you talk more about that in terms of the targeting of Black women by police? Is that something that you're seeing is more common in other metro areas, or was this just specific to Daniel Holtzclaw?
So there is a large percentage of Black women who are filing claims, complaints rather, against police officers for sexual assault and touching. So it's not limited to Oklahoma City. It's all across the country. And these were African American, they were Black women, but they were specifically women who had contact with the justice system. And they were women who, some of them had drug issues. So these were women who people would not care as much about. So if these women say, oh, he attacked me, he raped me, he sexually assaulted me, because of their background, and this is unfortunate, but we know this to be true, that women who are not squeaky clean housewives are looked at as less than, are looked at as liars and thieves. And there's no way that this upstanding young man would rape this Black woman, this poor, uneducated Black woman who's been to jail 3 times. So he purposely sought out Black, poor women who had contact with the justice system. And those points are important because that's what's happening across the country.
Thank you for underscoring that. And I think, it really underscores both for Daniel Holtzclaw as well as the sexual assaulters in the midst of police around the country, truly not just racist, but sociopathic impulse to go after people who are less likely to be believed, particularly within the criminal punishment system. What lessons have you learned from that case about pursuing justice for survivors of rape, specifically when the rapist is law enforcement?
3 things that we learned is, A, you have to keep the pressure on. You have to have the public and the community and media attention. It is essential. If you don't have that, then things will happen in the background that will not be addressed. There has to be coverage. There has to be people who will come out and say, hey, what's going on here? Let me get this story out. Let me interview some people. And as organizers and advocates, you have to get ready to have your narrative out. Number 2, the second thing we know is that we have to defend the survivors. The first thing that happened when this case started was there was an assault. There was a reputational assault on the survivors. All of a sudden, all of them became criminals, and they were, lies were put out about them, about what they were even charged with, even when they were in contact with justice system, and all of them were not. But it became pretty horrible for them. So as advocates and organizers, you have to be ready to defend. You have to be ready to say, this is all incorrect. The point of this case is that he's a rapist, not that someone has been to jail for, not paying a ticket. That's not the issue. The issue is the rape. And the third thing that we know about protecting survivors is they need their anonymity. You cannot start saying their name if they don't want their name said. You have to ensure that they feel safe if you're organizing and you're advocating. And you can offer services for them, which is great, but you cannot push the service on them. They have to feel as if they're in control of the situation, and you need to support the survivors, not try to direct them in any way, but support what they're going through. And many times during the trial, that means anonymity. That means you do need to protect their identity if they are not releasing it.
Thank you for that. So I have another question for you that's a little different, but I'm just so interested by your background and your art. And specifically, how do you see your art and your activism in terms of a Venn diagram, is there tension between your art and your activism ever? Are there some pieces that are together and some that are separate? I'm just really interested to hear more about that as well.
Yeah, so I'm a poet, I'm a spoken word actor, I'm a poet, spoken word artist as well. So with that, there's no clash for me. A lot of things, a lot of my subjects are about justice. They're about justice for women. A lot of my work is about being a womanist. You know, I believe in the rights of women, and that we have to be very clear about what is acceptable and not. So for me, that has never clashed with the need for justice for Black women, because it's, in art, I think we have so much freedom to talk about things that are taboo, to really push the envelope and put things in people's faces, even if it makes them uncomfortable, even if you squirm in your seat. You can't say nobody told you. You can't say you never heard of it. And I think that gives all artists really a way to kind of break through some of the walls and really address issues that otherwise can't always be addressed in academia or, you know, at churches. We always can't talk about everything we need to, but as artists, we can always push it. So it's never a conflict at all.
That's wonderful. And that just, it brings a smile to my face. And I also want to encourage our listeners, those who identify with art and those who don't at all, but just identify as activists, that we can all push boundaries and be courageous in speaking up. So that's very inspiring. Thank you so much, Grace. Is there anything else you would like to say before I move us on to next steps in Q&A?
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to mention about the Holtzclaw case, which I thought, which I think is very important in looking at other cases around the country, the Fraternal Order of Police, the Oklahoma City Fraternal Order of Police, did not back him, which is almost unheard of with any police officer who's charged with sexual assault or any type of crime. Usually the Union for the Police is always on it. There has to be a plan to push against that as well. Because my question would have been, if they did back him, is how do you back this man when you know the charges are heavy enough and severe enough that he's going on trial? You know, the police unions are very powerful. They're very invasive in the communities, is the best way I can say it. And they have to be held accountable too. When you have officers who are being charged with rape and later being convicted, but you were defending them, and that has to be addressed as well, because that's a certain amount of money and power that gives police officers more support financially than they need when you're being charged with rape and assault, in my opinion. That's the only thing I would want to add to that.
Oh, thank you. And I lit up over here because I can't tell you how many times I have personally tried to unsubscribe from fundraising calls from the Fraternal Order of Police. They just keep calling, and I've tried a million times. And from here on out, I'm changing my script, and I'm going to start asking about their policy on sexual assault allegations against police. And if I would like to get a policy back, but if nothing else, maybe it'll get them to stop calling me and asking for my money. So thank you for that. All right, well, thank you. And I want to encourage everyone to type in any questions you have for Grace as well as Chelsea into the chat box, and Pamela will get to as many of them as possible. Thank you, Grace. So I want to encourage everyone on the line to plug into Reproaction's work. Please sign up for email alerts at www.reproaction.org. I promise that means you won't miss a thing, whether it's invitations to our monthly Act and Learn webinars that we do diving into topics, or action alerts so that you can sign petitions, or once conditions permit again and it supports public health, opportunities to take direct action on the ground with us. You can also follow us on social media. We'd love to connect with you there. We are Reproaction on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And please save the date for our next Act and Learn webinar that's taking place on Wednesday, May 20th at 2 p.m. Eastern. The topic will be still pregnant after trying self-managed abortion, how to know the signs and what to do. So with that, I will pass it over to Pamela to go through any questions.
Thank you very much. So I'm waiting for folks to put their questions into the GoToWebinar control panel question tab. But while we do, I have some questions, of course, of my own. So picking up on what Grace said just a moment ago about the power and the role of the Fraternal Order of Police, and as somebody who lives in St. Louis and has watched the activism from Black Lives Matter and the amazing activism from Action St. Louis to unseat a very bad St. Louis County prosecutor who is definitely not holding law enforcement accountable, I'm really interested in diving a little bit deeper into the role that the Fraternal Order of Police and police unions play. Specifically, I'll give this question first to Chelsea. If you could talk a little bit more about the kind of contracts that police unions negotiate and how they have protection against oversight kind of built into their contract with the city.
Sure. And I should probably preface this by saying my dad was a police officer for about 30 years in rural Indiana. So I am unfortunately very familiar with the Fraternal Order of Police and how they operate. So what I do know is, and I think this is nationwide, but each FOP organization essentially contracts with a group of local attorneys to provide legal counsel for situations that officers may find themselves in. Most of the time it's, something pretty easy like wills or, employment claims, etc. But you do see a lot of criminal representation being pulled from these contracts too. So if anyone was paying attention in St. Louis a few years ago when we had the Stockley decision, which involved a police officer who shot an unarmed Black man, and a video camera caught surveillance of all of it, and then he planted a gun on the dead man along with drugs. That officer, Jason Stockley, he got legal representation through the St. Louis POA, Police Officers Association, which is, I believe, connected to the Fraternal Order of Police. They just call themselves something different. So these organizations essentially have agreements that they will either pay for completely or provide reduced legal assistance for police officers when they find themselves in legal situations that they need an attorney for. So not just your traffic tickets or, estate planning, but serious crimes such as this. And from what I've observed, there doesn't seem to be a lot of discretion as to what types of cases these organizations will shell out money for, as far as providing legal defense for, a sexual assault claim, or even, an officer who's been accused of murder.
Thank you for that. And Grace, did you want to add anything to that?
Oh no, yeah, that was great. Pretty much, that's the legal defense. Attorney premiums are pretty high, as we all know. So if you get a reduction in your cost of a defense lawyer, that means you can get an even better defense lawyer without paying for it, or with getting a reduced amount. And our issue with that is that regular civilians aren't able to do that. Regular civilians have to either find their own attorneys, or they have to use a public defender. So why is it that a police officer can have access to that when they are being charged with a crime that doesn't, especially specific crimes, murder, rape, assault, that's a violent crime. So why should they have access to that when regular civilians don't?
Good question, and obviously a question we need to be asking. Thank you. So I have another question, and this is from a member of Communities United Against Police Brutality and also a survivor of police sexual assault, who was thanking us for the webinar, and you are very welcome. It's our pleasure. So the question was, I work with families of people who have been killed by police and have encountered a challenge balancing the desires of the families with the desires of the movement. So how do you handle it? For example, if the survivors don't want protests or actions, but we still need to apply pressure to ensure the cop is held accountable. Grace, would you like to take that first?
Yes. I think you have to balance the needs and wants of the family. One of the things about protesting, especially when you're a person of color who's the victim, you don't want the backlash. The backlash is swift and the backlash is hard. What I tend to do in other situations, even when there's death, is we like to talk about with the family ways in which they would like for the protest to happen, opposed to if you want a protest to happen. Because what they do have to understand is, even if as an organization we don't organize, there can be people who will. So how do you want your loved one to be represented in this protest if it is going to occur, so they can have some type of input on what is happening? You know, some families do not want a violent protest. Some families just want like a candlelight vigil. Some families just don't want anything to be turned into something that's violent. And that is one of the biggest things. So you just have to work with them and give them options and what it can look like. Because it will happen whether they want it to or not.
That's true. That's very true. Thank you for that. Chelsea, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Sure. I completely agree. A lot of times, you know, my clients or I will be approached by activists who very respectfully ask, how can we support? So not always do my clients want protesters outside of the courthouse or a gallery of folks watching at their hearings being supportive. They would prefer to keep things as quiet as possible. And, you know, that's always first and foremost. My priority is just making sure that my client, that they're comfortable and that it's, you know, the situation is what they want it to be, all things considered. So I think there are other ways that activism can be channeled if, you know, the victim does not want the publicity attached. I've connected some folks with their legislators to specifically discuss laws, you know, that do affect victims or police behavior. So for example, I think a few years ago and every other year, we've had a few state legislators who have been trying to pass a law that makes it illegal for a police officer to engage in any sort of sexual conduct while he or she is on duty. In the state of Missouri, we don't have laws that outlaw that yet. So I think, you know, paying attention to what's going on in your state legislatures a lot of times is a way to really channel that activism and that desire to change without, you know, compromising a victim's comfort with the situation or their wishes of how they want, you know, their public, not so public, what have you situation. So I think there's always an option and always a way to share your voice and to elevate the voices of others. But it does boil down to, you know, having respect for the victim or the family and making sure that they are comfortable at all possible stages with what we're doing as attorneys or activists or organizers.
Thank you so much for that. So we've got just 5. We always are super on time. So I'm mindful of the time. We have 6 minutes and we have an awesome follow-up question. How do you address the issue of a police department covering up for the police officer as a way to reduce their liability. And I'm going to take just a framing of this because some of it's to reduce liability, and there's certainly an angle of that, and some of that is again that thin blue line which kicks into gear. So I can personally attest to the frustration both with the murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson, where police where the testimony was not matching up with the physical evidence that the police officer said had happened to him. And we often hear people talk about the initial description of how that altercation happened versus what the officer looked like 24 hours after it. He didn't, talk of a broken orbital or a serious assault, and the picture that they finally released after he was not indicted clearly showed that that had not happened. And then you have another case that took place in St. Louis about 3 blocks from where I live, where a young man named Von Meyer was shot by a police officer. And I, as somebody who lives in the neighborhood, it was very clear from the description and everything that that the description of the landscape didn't actually necessarily line up with the reality. So I think there's layers of cover up that can happen to the point where it's just a running a bit of sad humor in St. Louis that there's always a gun. They always are able to supply a gun when there's a shooting. So I think that this question is important. And so how do you address the department cover up so that you can, what kind of reforms need to take place so that this doesn't keep happening? Grace, would you take that first?
Sure. I think, like you were saying, the layers. So in the case with Daniel Holtzclaw, it could be said that the police department was covering up some issues that happened prior to the first person filing the rape charge. He actually had a complaint of excessive force where he broke a woman's arm. He actually threw a woman up against a brick wall trying to arrest her, and a complaint was filed about that. So initially, no one knew anything about this. The report was lost, nothing happened. And then as the case went on, there was information that you will find during the case of many, during the actual trial, when the trial is happening. You cannot always address that depending on what it is at the time, but you take note of that. And when it's over, when this trial is over, you go back to that police department, back to that chief of police, back to that department and say, wait a minute, what is this procedure? Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Why didn't you do that? Because there are so many things that they try to hide that it's almost like somebody's trying to tell a lie. They can't always keep the lie straight. So eventually the information always comes out, and sometimes you have to go back to it and then deal with them then instead of dealing with it in the event of a trial. And then sometimes you can deal with it in the trial itself. But I find that many times you have to just go back and then address it then. You have to take note of it and try to do things in almost like a 3-pronged way. But you definitely go back and address them on all the things that were incorrect.
Got it. We've got 2 minutes. Chelsea, did you want to add anything to that?
I can real quick. So I have found success in getting local media involved in situations where that police are intentionally hiding things. In my experience, local media is going to have access to information and resources that even I as an attorney may not have. And then a second way to sort of keep feet to the fire, so to speak, is to look into your states. In Missouri, we call them sunshine laws. I know in Indiana, they call them FOIA, Freedom of Information Act laws, but those are essentially public record disclosures. And each state's going to have their own ins and outs of what members of the public can request. But I think that it's often overlooked as a tool to really start digging into the operations and things that actually happen in police departments. So those are just two suggestions that I have as well, as far as starting to really dig into situations where you know the police are covering up situations of abuse.
Thank you so much. And we are right at time. Chelsea Merta, attorney and founder of Lotus Law and Legal Services. Grace E. Franklin, founder and executive director of OKAJ. Did I get that right?
Yes, that worked.
Woo! Awesome. Thank you so much for this informative and important webinar. Thank you for sharing this information in ways that people can advocate in their communities. I'd like to thank our attendees for your fantastic questions. And as always, thank my co-director for being an awesome person. Thank you, Erin, and have a great and wonderful rest of your day or afternoon.